What would your younger self say about how your family turned out?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? I spent 1 year doing the polite thing, smiling through the little slights, brushing off the missed calls, pretending that it did not sting when everyone else's milestones were turned into grand family events, while mine were treated like a footnote. And do you know what that patience bought me? Absolutely nothing. Yesterday they skipped my birthday again. Today I finally realized I had to stop playing the part they wrote for me, and once I let myself admit that, everything began to shift. I need you to understand how ordinary it looked from the outside, because that is the trap of it. When you tell someone your family forgets your birthday, they assume it is an accident, or that you must have been hard to reach, or that your parents are just getting older and forgetful. That is not what this is. They never forgot Lauren's birthday, not once, not in 30+ years. Her celebrations have always been circled on the calendar with thick marker and surrounded by 3 days of errands and decorations and group photos. Mine? It would usually be a casual text from my mom saying something like, "Happy birthday, honey. We'll do something later this week. It's just been so busy." And then later never arrived, or later was me bringing a cake to my parents' house and acting like that was what I wanted. This year, when the day came and went, my phone lit up only once after 9 at night. It was a short message: "So sorry, crazy week. Let's celebrate soon." That was it. No calls, no dinner, no acknowledgement from anyone except my Aunt Jo, who has always been the only person willing to say the quiet thing out loud. "They don't forget you, Maya. They expect you to understand." And hearing her say it this time hit me harder than ever before, because I finally admitted to myself that she was right. It is not that they lost track of time, it is that they decided my feelings could wait. And here is where I stopped doing the usual thing. Normally, I would send reminders for the next weekend, suggest we go to dinner, cover the cost of the cake, and basically manufacture my own celebration so nobody would have to feel guilty. This time I turned off every reminder I had set for their birthdays, anniversaries, and events. I deleted them from my phone calendar. If they could not be bothered to remember mine, then I was done carrying the weight of remembering theirs. I know that might sound small, but you have no idea how much energy it takes to always be the one managing everyone else's milestones, to always be the backup plan, the organizer, the safety net. Letting go of that was my first quiet revenge. It also made me look at money differently. I sat down and added up how much I had spent in the past year covering gaps in their plans. Extra decorations, last-minute bakery runs, deposits for rentals that nobody else wanted to front until the day before. It added up to thousands, and not once did anyone thank me beyond a distracted, "You're the best." When I saw the total, I made a promise to myself: none of that money is leaving my account this summer. If I was invisible at celebrations, then I was invisible when it came to paying for them too. Work, meanwhile, was at its peak stress point. Our quarter had been brutal. I had pulled 3 impossible projects across the finish line, sleeping on the couch in my office twice, smoothing over messes that other people had made but would never be blamed for. By the end, I was so wrung out that when my manager Grant asked if I had any plans for the weekend, I laughed and said, "What plans?" My family skipped my birthday again. He didn't laugh. He just gave me this look and said, "You might want to make some." I thought he was just being kind, but something in his tone made me pause. I went home that night and sat at my kitchen table, staring at my phone. I did not text my parents back. I did not try to rally anyone into belated plans. I did not do the thing I always do where I smooth everything over so nobody has to feel uncomfortable. Instead, I opened a blank note on my phone and titled it, "Things I Do Not Finance Anymore." The first line I typed was other people's excuses. And when I saw those words, I realized I was finally done. That small act, sitting in silence with myself instead of chasing their attention, was the beginning of something bigger than I could have imagined. And if you think the story ends with me sulking or cutting ties, you would be wrong, because what I did next is something I had never dared before. Grant's words kept echoing in my head. "You might want to make some plans." I didn't know what he meant, but I knew he was hinting at something. And the funny thing about hints is that once you hear them, you start to look for signs everywhere. What I could not have predicted was how fast those signs would arrive, and how quickly one forgotten birthday would lead me down a road that none of them saw coming. Because this was only the first step, and the real shock was still waiting to land. When the dust of my so-called birthday celebration had already settled into the usual silence, the group chat suddenly came alive with banners of excitement because Lauren was planning her champagne boat party and, as always, it was not framed as an invitation, but rather as a directive, complete with a breakdown of costs, suggested outfits, a schedule, and even a spreadsheet where family members could sign up for contributions toward extras like floral arrangements, an upgraded sound system, and a professional photographer, none of which had ever been mentioned for any of my milestones, not once in my entire adult life. Yet here I was, expected to throw in money without a second thought, as though the memory of my forgotten birthday was supposed to dissolve the second her party plan dropped. I stared at that chat for a long time, not because I was surprised. Nothing about Lauren's appetite for spectacle surprises me anymore, but because the timing made me feel like they were daring me to notice the contrast, daring me to speak up, daring me to point out the absurdity of the fact that 3 days earlier I had been too busy for even a dinner, yet now they all had unlimited energy for champagne cruises, themed playlists, and color-coordinated decorations. And here is where I have to confess something. I almost typed out a sarcastic message about how maybe my birthday could be celebrated on the dock as a side event, just to save them the trouble of remembering me next year, but instead I closed my phone, because I realized sarcasm would only be twisted back into me being difficult. I did go to the boat party, because refusing altogether would have been turned into evidence that I was the problem, that I was unsupportive, that I was jealous, and frankly I did not have the energy to hand them that kind of ammunition. So I showed up for exactly 1 hour, dressed simply, paid only for my seat, and made sure that when the champagne toast began, I slipped away quietly before the slideshow of Lauren's curated life started playing on the giant rented screen. Nobody noticed me leaving, or if they did, they pretended not to, and the only person who looked vaguely confused was Aunt Jo, who caught my eye as I walked off the dock and gave me a nod that said more than any words could have. The truth is, the moment I stepped off that boat, I felt lighter than I had in years, because for once I had not overextended myself trying to prove I was a good daughter or a supportive sister. I had not loaned money for decorations that nobody else wanted to cover. I had not bought gifts for every guest to take home so that Lauren could look more generous than she actually was. I had simply shown up, met the minimum, and refused to be drafted into the role of family financier. That decision became a line I would not cross again. Lauren, of course, tried to push it further before the night was even over. She caught me at the dock just as I was heading for my car, all sparkle and laughter, and asked if I could front the deposit for her next idea, which she described as a series of monthly themed parties that would really put us on the map socially. I told her, with no hesitation, that I was not lending money this year. She laughed like I was joking, like the idea that I might keep my own money was hilarious, and waved it off, assuming I would come around once she sent me the details. But I went home, opened that same note in my phone titled "Things I Do Not Finance Anymore," and added another line, Lauren's ideas. It was not just about the money. It was about how natural it had become for everyone to assume that my role was to pick up the slack, to quietly make things happen so they could enjoy the spotlight without interruption. When the cupcakes did not arrive on time, it was me who drove across town to fix it. When the rental place needed a deposit, it was me who swiped my card, just until everyone else chipped in, except they rarely did. When the timeline slipped, I was the one filling the gaps. And for the first time in years, I decided I would not lift a finger to patch the holes. So when, the very next morning, my phone buzzed with a panicked message in the group chat that the custom cupcakes had been forgotten, and could someone please rush to pick them up before the guests noticed, I set my phone face down on the table and walked away. I made coffee, I cleaned my apartment, I sat in silence, and I let the chaos belong to the people who created it. The party survived without me, of course. They always act like it will all fall apart if I am not there to cover the gaps, but the truth is, they just like the convenience of never having to adjust. And watching them scramble while I finally did nothing felt like a tiny taste of justice, one I had denied myself for far too long. That evening, as I sat back on my couch, exhausted but strangely satisfied, I noticed an email from Grant sitting in my inbox. At first, I thought it was just a follow-up from the quarter's end, maybe a summary or a set of reminders for the next sprint, but when I opened it, I saw my name on a message I was not supposed to see, a forwarded email chain from the board. My eyes went straight to one line, and it stopped me cold because it was about me, and it was not a criticism or a complaint, it was something entirely different, something that would change the trajectory of my summer in a way I could never have predicted. And in that moment, sitting there with the glow of my laptop on my face and the muffled sound of my neighbors laughing outside their door, I realized the universe had just handed me the first real card I could play in this quiet, endless game I had been losing for years. What I chose to do with it would either expose me completely or free me forever. When I clicked open the forwarded chain and saw my name threaded between the stiff corporate phrases, I braced for the usual performance review language about scope and collaboration, yet there it was in clean, unmistakable lines. A retention award approved by the board for the handful of us who had kept the quarter from sliding off a cliff, not a lottery ticket and not life-changing money on its own, but a sum that, combined with the quiet savings I had forced into existence by refusing to bankroll anyone else's theatrics, could tilt a decision from someday to now, and as I read the terms, keep it confidential, stay through year-end, do not make a spectacle, I felt a kind of steady heat move through me that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with finally choosing my own life, without asking for permission from people who could not be bothered to show up for a single dinner. Grant had written one short line above the thread that said, in his dry way, that I might want to make some plans after all. And I sat there thinking about what plans actually look like when you stop performing the role of family treasurer and start treating yourself like a person whose time and effort have value, because it turns out plans are not spa days and impulse purchases. They are structure and paperwork and decisions that make other people uncomfortable. So the next morning I called a friend of Aunt Joe's who worked with small businesses and asked how quickly I could form a simple limited liability company. Nothing flashy and nothing complicated. Just a clean container with a neutral name that would let me buy property without turning my personal finances into a group project, and by the end of that call I had forms in my inbox, a checklist on my counter, and a resolve that felt calmer than anything I had felt in years. While the paperwork moved, I made another list that would have sounded petty to anyone who has never been the family's default problem solver. A list of places within a 3-hour drive where people with normal jobs and normal budgets buy old cabins that still have good bones. Places where you can spend a weekend scraping old paint and fixing a screen door and feel your shoulders drop. Places where the value is not in being seen, but in closing the laptop and letting your brain hear itself think. And I will admit that writing that list felt like drawing a map out of a life I had not realized was so small until I stopped apologizing for wanting something of my own. Aunt Joe, who has a talent for connecting threads others pretend are not there, said she knew a friend of a friend who needed to sell a small place fast to avoid carrying 2 mortgages, and before I could overthink it she had me on the phone with a woman who spoke in plain, grateful sentences about a 1-story cabin with a modest deck and a lot line that actually touches the water, not the glittering side of the lake where every weekend is a competition, but the quiet side where you haul your own trash and nobody cares what brand your cooler is, and we talked numbers and timelines and inspections in a way that was so refreshingly adult that I felt a little embarrassed about how often my family discussions devolve into guilt and favors. And when we hung up I knew I was done looking. The inspection was not a surprise party, which, frankly, felt like a miracle. The place needed ordinary things that ordinary people fix, and the price reflected that honesty. And while the inspector walked the property with me, I kept thinking about how many deposits I had floated for other people's events, how many times I had picked up late invoices to save someone from embarrassment, how many hundreds had turned into thousands over the years, and how, if I had set boundaries sooner, this choice might have been available long ago, though I refused to waste energy on regret because the entire point of this move was to stop measuring my life against what my family did or did not do. Forming the company took less time than watching one of Lauren's party recap videos, and when the bank account opened under the neutral, boring name I had chosen, I felt a strange relief in the blandness, because bland meant no performance, no bait for drama. Just a simple vehicle for a simple goal, and once the wire instructions were in place and the closing date fixed on the calendar, I made one last choice that felt almost ceremonial in its quiet defiance, which was to mute the family group chat for one full week so that every little flare of chaos could burn without me. Every panic over a playlist or a delivery window could pass through the people who created it, and in the silence that followed I heard, for the first time in a long time, my own decision ringing clear. On the morning of closing, I drove to the title office with the kind of calm that makes other people ask if you're excited, and the truth is I was not excited in the confetti sense. I was resolved. And when the officer slid the papers across the table and read my name from the documents and said congratulations, I signed in long deliberate strokes, and I did not think about whether my parents would approve, or whether Lauren would find a way to make it about her, or whether anyone would accuse me of being secretive, because secrecy is hiding, and this was not hiding, this was privacy, this was putting my oxygen mask on first and not apologizing for breathing. I walked out with a folder, a ring of keys, and the kind of quiet that hums in your chest when something finally aligns, and I had just set the folder on the passenger seat when my phone lit up with a new message from the group chat. The bubbles stacking fast as if a storm had broken, and Lauren's name popped to the top with a glittering banner and a line that said there would be a big announcement tonight, a teaser drop and a series launch and sponsors watching, and all I could do was laugh. Not because any of this was funny, but because timing, when you stop forcing it, sometimes hands you a perfect test of who you have decided to be, and as the notifications rolled in like little alarms, I realized I knew exactly what I would post, and exactly when, and exactly how silent I would be while the people who never remembered me tried to catch up to a life I no longer needed their permission to claim. By the time the closing folder was tucked under my arm and the keys were warming a little circle on my palm like a quiet promise, Lauren had already fired the first salvo of her new campaign with a gold confetti teaser and a countdown headline that treated her boat party not as a single afternoon, but as the opening of a summer series, complete with sponsor tags, a brand partner shout-out, and an airy promise that there would be themed weekends, curated guest lists, and a rotating set of photo backdrops that would be updated based on engagement, and as the group chat filled with heart reactions and breathless replies about how we would go big for Lauren, as always, I sat in my car with the engine off and understood with startling clarity that this was the perfect moment to act without a speech, because for once I had something to say that did not require anyone's permission and did not need to be explained to death. And if I timed it correctly, the contrast would do the talking for me. I drove out to the lake with a notebook, a roll of painter's tape, and a bag of basic groceries that I had bought without drama, and even though the place was exactly as described, modest and honest and in need of the kind of work you do in soft clothes with a podcast for company, I kept the lens narrow on purpose, because the pictures did not need to sell anything to strangers. They needed to convey a simple, undeniable fact to people who had built a life on pretending not to see me, so I took exactly 3 photos, and I refused to overthink them. The first was my keys resting on the cabin's threshold, because the act of crossing into something of my own mattered more than whether the trim needed repainting. The second was the view from the screen door in a straight line to the water, because the fact that the property actually touched the lake was the only detail that would land with the people who equate worth with access. And the third was a folded receipt with my bland little company name visible, because I knew the first accusation would be that I had used family money or a secret favor, and I wanted the proof of a clean paper trail to sit there without me ever putting it into words. Before I scheduled anything, I sent exactly 3 private invitations to the only people who had shown up for me without prompting and without keeping score. I texted Aunt Jo and asked her to bring nothing but herself and whatever snack she would be happy to eat on a deck without railings yet. I messaged my friend Tia and told her that the first weekend was for quiet people who like to read and laugh and fix squeaky hinges. And I sent a simple thank you note to Grant and his partner with an open offer for a low-key day by the water whenever they needed to unplug, and that was it. No parents, no sister, no performative inclusivity that would only turn into a referendum on whether I was doing hospitality correctly, just a small intentional circle that could fit around a thrift store table without anyone posturing. Then I set the timing, not because I wanted to play petty games, but because choreography is how you survive a family that runs on optics. I cued the 3 photos to post a few minutes after Lauren's second teaser dropped so that the audience for her grand reveal and the audience that would see my quiet proof would overlap just enough to force an honest comparison. And while I was in the calendar, I created 2 separate event blocks called Maya's Celebration Weekend, and I sent them to exactly those same 3 people, because I needed the absence to be visible to me as much as to anyone else. I needed to see my calendar fill with names that did not argue with my boundaries and did not require a full deck of disclaimers before they could enjoy an afternoon. In the hours before the scheduled post, the chat found its usual frenzy rhythm as Lauren and her husband polished the rollout with language about exclusivity and experiences and social reach. And I said nothing because the new rule I had set for myself was silence in place of justification, and even though I felt my stomach tighten when my mother chimed in with a line about how it would be so good for the family to be seen out together, I kept my phone on the table and went outside to tape labels on the breakers, to scrub the sink until it stopped smelling like neglect, to carry a folding chair onto the small deck and sit with a pen while I wrote a short list of house rules that were less about control and more about protecting the tone that I wanted to live in. Things like bring what you need and take what you brought, and the dock is for listening as much as for talking, because if I was going to spend weekends here, I needed to separate the word family from the reflex to entertain. When the time came, the teaser hit the chat with a glittering frame and a call to action, and I watched the reactions pile up, knowing exactly what would come next because the sequence is as predictable as a metronome in this house. A few seconds later, my 3 photos went live with no caption, no winking line, no argument, just the keys, the view, and the folded receipt, and for a heartbeat nothing happened, which made me suspect I had misjudged the power of quiet. But then my phone vibrated hard enough to slide on the table as the comments and messages began to flood in with the kind of intensity you would think people would reserve for an emergency. My mother called once, and then twice, and then a third time. My father wrote a long paragraph that had clearly been typed at speed about transparency and respect. Lauren sent a sharp little question about whether I had timed this to sabotage her rollout, and my Aunt Jo simply texted the word proud. And, while all of that scrolled at once, I felt a certainty I can only describe as oxygen, because as the chat name flipped from the usual cheerful label to the panicked family emergency, I thought, with a steadiness that surprised me, this changes the rules forever. And I put my phone face down without answering a single thing, because the point was never to argue. The point was to make an announcement that required no explanation at all. The eruption that followed my 3 quiet photographs was louder and faster than anything I had anticipated, and while part of me should have expected it, given the years of conditioning that taught my family to view every choice as either a group project or a potential betrayal, the sheer velocity of their outrage still managed to catch me off guard, because within minutes of posting the pictures, I had missed calls stacking on top of one another, long paragraphs of text flying into the group chat, and accusations wrapped in the flimsy disguise of concern, each one written as if my decision to buy a modest cabin with money I had earned on my own had somehow destabilized the family order. And as I sat there with my phone buzzing across the counter, I realized that what they were really angry about was not the cabin itself, but the fact that I had acted without telling them, without asking for validation, without handing over the narrative so that they could make themselves central to a story that was never about them. My mother's messages came first, each one framed as a worried inquiry, but carrying the sharp edge of judgment that has always been her weapon of choice. Why had I not shared the process with them? Was I trying to hide something? Did I not think it was important to include them in a major family investment? My father followed close behind, less polished and more blunt, asking straight out whether I had dipped into family money or borrowed funds from Aunt Jo, as though the possibility that I might be capable of managing a purchase of this size on my own was so unthinkable that the only explanation must be some sort of deception. And then, of course, Lauren entered the scene with her usual dramatic flourish, firing off a series of clipped sentences that made it abundantly clear she believed my timing had been deliberate sabotage, that my calm, captionless photographs had been designed to overshadow her glittering rollout, and that I was guilty of turning her carefully orchestrated moment into a backdrop for my own declaration. For a few minutes I just let it all pour in, because I needed to see the raw truth of their reactions before I decided how to respond, and what became painfully clear was that none of them asked whether I was happy, or whether the place suited me, or even whether I needed help with the inevitable repairs. Their focus was entirely on appearances, on what people would think, on how they themselves would look in the light of my choice, and that clarity hardened something inside me that had been soft and accommodating for far too long. I knew I had to respond once, not to appease them, not to argue, but to put into writing the truth I had been circling for years. So I composed a single message, not long enough to spiral into debate, but not short enough to be dismissed, and in that message I wrote that I had bought the cabin with my own funds, that I had done so because I was tired of being treated like the backup generator in a family that only notices me when the power goes out, and that from this point forward I would no longer be underwriting parties, projects, or productions that left me erased in the final tally. I ended the note by saying that the cabin was not a stage, it was my home, and that if they wanted to visit, the only condition was that they arrive without scorecards or agendas. I hit send, muted the chat, and put the phone down with a steadiness that felt like setting down a heavy load I had carried across too many miles. The fallout was immediate. My parents demanded a proper family weekend at the cabin to reset the tone and show unity. Language that might have sounded reasonable if it were not dripping with the expectation that my new space should be co-opted into the same endless cycle of control and performance. Lauren and her husband attempted to bypass me altogether by sending proposed dates directly to my email, framed as though they were doing me a favor by taking initiative, but I declined each one with the same two-word reply: not available. It was not an argument, it was not a negotiation, it was a line, and watching their frustration build in the silence of my refusal gave me more peace than any long-winded confrontation ever could have. The final act of revenge, if you want to call it that, came when I posted one last statement in the group chat before leaving it entirely for a month, a message that was not venomous, but precise, where I said, "Next summer I will only celebrate my birthday with people who put it on their own calendar without being reminded. If that is you, you will have the address." It was the cleanest line I had ever drawn, and the weight of it landed not because it was loud, but because it forced everyone to sit with the truth that for years they had expected me to carry the memory of them while they consistently refused to carry the memory of me. The silence that followed was not empty. It was charged, full of unspoken recognition, and for the first time in decades, I did not rush to fill it. Instead, I turned off my notifications, packed a folding chair and a bag of groceries, and drove back to the cabin where Aunt Jo was waiting with her usual dry humor and a sack of tomatoes from her garden. We sat on the small deck together, our feet propped on the railing that still needed sanding, and while the water lapped gently against the shore, I turned my phone face down and let myself feel the enormity of what I had just done. I had not screamed, I had not begged, I had not delivered a grand speech. I had simply opened a door of my own and walked through it. A week later, while I was sanding down the steps in the early evening light, a single message buzzed through, not from my parents and not from Lauren, but from someone I never expected, my cousin Rachel. The one who had always floated at the edges of the drama without committing to either side. Her text was short but startling. "I saw your photos. When can I come see it? I'll bring the wine." And as I stood there with dust clinging to my hands, I realized that this was the twist nobody in my family had anticipated, that when you stop begging for attention and start living without permission, the people who actually want to see you, not the version of you that serves their story, will find their way through the silence. I did not slam any doors. I just stopped holding them open for people who refused to walk through. And if you ask me whether it was worth it, whether the cabin and the fallout and the noise were worth the risk, I will tell you this. The moment I turned my phone face down and heard only the sound of the water, I knew I had already won.